All right, greetings everyone, and welcome to the third New Sweden Legacy Lectures of 2025. My name is Lauren Burnham, and I'm the Assistant Director at the American Swedish Historical Museum and the co-chair of the New Sweden Legacy Lecture Committee. On behalf of the committee, thank you all so much for joining this evening. We are honored to host Evan Haefeli for his talk, New Sweden's Colonists under Dutch Rule 1655 to 1664. Before we hear from our program sponsor this evening and begin the talk, I have a few quick Zoom reminders for everyone. We ask that you please keep yourself on mute during the duration of the lecture to reduce any background noise. If you have questions during the presentation, please go ahead and you can type them in chat and we'll get to them after the talk. And then once the lecture is completed, we will open the Q&A session. And during that time, you can also use the raise hand feature and our moderator, Brett Peters, will call on you to ask your question live. Finally, this program is being recorded and will be available on the American Swedish Historical Museum's YouTube channel next week for further viewing. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Sheila Romine for a message from tonight's organizational sponsor, the New Sweden Alliance. Thank you. And Sheila?
Hello, and welcome from New Sweden Alliance, your sponsor for the evening. I'm excited to be able to share a little bit about our organization with you and introduce you to it. I hope I can spark some interest for you to look into us further, or maybe even to join us. And so to begin, let me share my screen here. New Sweden Alliance is a 501c3 nonprofit. It's a group of cooperative member organizations that raise awareness and celebrate the heritage of the New Sweden colony. Our mission is to promote the culture, history, and contributions of this 17th century colony in the Delaware Valley. And I'd like to shout out to the members of our organization. They are on your screen: American Swedish Historical Museum, Delaware Swedish Colonial Society, the Finnish American Society of the Delaware Valley, Historic Gloria Dei Preservation Corporation, Kalmar Nickel Foundation, New Sweden Center, Old Swedes Foundation, Sister Cities of Wilmington, and the Swedish Colonial Society. A little bit about our history. Founded in 2012 for the 375th anniversary of New Sweden, we collaborated with ambassadors from Sweden and Finland to produce a grand celebration, which included visits from the Swedish royal family, the Finnish Prime Minister, and the US Vice President, and certain celebrities. And since then, our alliance has continued working together, supporting each other's events and ensuring that this history remains alive. Why does this history matter, you might ask? How many people do you know who have never heard of New Sweden Colony? Many in the Delaware Valley walk on land once claimed by Sweden without even knowing it. They don't know that in 1638, the Swedish flagship Kalmar Nickel landed at a natural wharf of Blue Rocks in what is today Wilmington, Delaware, home of the Blue Rocks teams, of course, and established a permanent settlement in this region. They don't know that Wilmington's Christina River was named for a queen, the Swedish queen. They don't know that the settlers introduced log cabin technology that we know today, or that they thrived with fur trade with the Lenape, Minquas, and Susquehannock tribes. And they don't know that this small colony once spanned parts of Delaware, southeastern Pennsylvania, and southern New Jersey. Since you're here for the New Sweden Legacy Lecture, you likely know a little bit about this history. But most people don't. That's why our mission is to raise awareness, and it's so important. How do we do it? New Sweden Alliance sponsors events like this lecture series. supports educational programs, offers grants, promotes events across our social media, and helps coordinate celebrations and activities that engage the public. I hope that learning a little bit of us has sparked your interest. How can you get involved? Well, first, follow us on Facebook. We share posts of our member organizations, including their individual events and items of historical content. If you have your phone, in fact, take it out and join our group and follow our page right now. Our social media handles and URLs are on the screen, and they'll be on the screen again at the end of the presentation. But the second way you can help is we're looking for volunteers. We need volunteer officers. You don't need to belong to another group, just have a passion for our mission. And third, if your organization wants to join our allowance, we'd love to connect. By collaborating, we can all strengthen our impact. Thank you for your time and enjoy the lecture tonight.
All right, everyone. Sorry about that now that I'm unmuted. My name is Brett Peters. I'm the curator of the American Swedish Historical Museum. I'm happy to be here tonight, and I'm happy to introduce Evan Haefeli. He's actually coming to you all the way from Japan, which is so cool. Evan Haefeli is a historian of colonial America and the Atlantic world, interested in Native American history as well as the religious and political aspects and consequences of early modern European expansion in the Americas, including the origins of American religious freedom. Evan joined Texas A&M University in 2014 after teaching at Princeton, Tufts, and Columbia universities, as well as the London School of Economics. He has held fellowships from various prestigious organizations, including the National Endowment for the Humanities and the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton. I'm so excited for tonight's talk. With that, Evan, I hand it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Brett. And good morning from tomorrow. It is tomorrow morning here in Tokyo, where I'm a Fulbright fellow, a Fulbright lecturer in American history of the year. And I just want to thank everyone for giving me the chance to talk to you and to present to you about this history. This is something I've been very interested in since I was a graduate student. So I've been doing bits and pieces of research on it for quite a while. And what I'm presenting to you is a new piece of research that I have been working on for the past year on a largely forgotten or overlooked period in the history of the Swedes and Finns in America, which is this decade, these 9 years when they were ruled by the Dutch. And so what I want to do today is focus on this period and highlight what we know about this history and give you some sense of why this period is important in the formation of the Swedish American community. We don't have a whole lot of sources about this period, which is one of the reasons I think why it tends to get overlooked. But I still think there is enough there that we can tell a story, and I think it's a pretty interesting one. So I think the big theme of this period is that this is when the Swedes and Finns in America go from being the colony of New Sweden, sort of a part of Sweden, part of Swedish society, with noblemen and ministers and administrators and soldiers and merchants and everybody from Sweden and directly connected to Sweden and going back and forth to the beginnings of a new American generation, what the Dutch and then the English would call the Swedish and Finnish nation of people living on the Delaware River. So that is, I think, the big overall theme. You could say this is the beginning of their Americanization and how they become a distinct community, still Swedish in origin, but separate from their um, Swedish ties. Now, most of you are familiar with the history of New Sweden to some extent, I assume, but just a quick um, resume to bring you up to speed. The Swedes, for about 20 years, had a colony in the Delaware River Valley, which claimed the entire Delaware River Valley. But one of the key things here is that most of the people in New Sweden were living up in what is now southeastern Pennsylvania. People talk a lot about how Delaware was a result of Swedish influence, and that's a little bit of the story, but really most of the Swedes in the center of the colony, the capital, that's where the church was, and the seat of government, all of that was up in what's now Upland County, Pennsylvania. The lower part of the Delaware River was largely uninhabited by Europeans in this period, uh, and what's now New Jersey. Really later on, it becomes important for Swedes in America, but in this period, the first half of the 17th century, basically nobody's living across the river. That's still New Jersey is really a frontier region until the late 1680s. So just think of the Swedes as living sort of in this core community, but surrounded by lots of land that's not really claimed or inhabited by Europeans and is still inhabited by Native Americans. Another thing to keep in mind about the colony is that it was pretty poor. There were not very many Swedes with lots of money involved. The main business that they hoped to earn money from with the colony was initially the fur trade. They, down in the Chesapeake, in Virginia and Maryland, they had made the transition to growing tobacco and then developing plantations, which became a major source of wealth for the English in the Chesapeake. They did started growing some tobacco in New Sweden, but they never developed anything like the plantations that the English had in the Chesapeake. Instead, the Swedes and Finnish colonists living in what's New Sweden and afterwards were basically subsistence farmers, sort of like, traditional frontier farmers in American history, sort of like the Daniel Boones and stuff, where they grew enough to eat for themselves and maybe some other food to trade, but they were not very wealthy themselves. They were not producing lot of uh, lots of products that could be sold to other people, but they were producing more than enough to take care of themselves and feed themselves. And so even though they were not very rich, they were very healthy and able to develop a thriving community with large families. And that is a really big part of the story here. It's still a pretty small community and they're still surrounded by Native Americans. They relied on having good relations with the Native Americans around them too, which is another important part of this background story. That's a key part of Swedish history in the 17th century Delaware is their relationship with Native Americans. That's not the main focus of my talk here, but I just raise that to keep that in mind. Now, the other thing I just want to highlight here for perspective is the broader context, which you get nicely with this map. You see the distance between Sweden and New Sweden. But also what I like about this map is it shows you that the Dutch in Amsterdam are in between Sweden and New Sweden. And the whole relationship between the Swedes and the Dutch and in New Sweden and back in Europe was a pretty complicated one. what I'll be talking about is how the Swedes were conquered by the Dutch and how the Dutch treated the Swedes after the conquest. But the Dutch had helped the Swedes start the colony in the first place. Some of the first explorers and the first investors in the colony came from the Netherlands, and so it was a real kind of ambivalent relationship that was really important to the whole existence of New Sweden, even though it all went sour in the end, and the Dutch decided to conquer the colony rather than let the Swedes remain in place. Another thing that I like about this map here that brings out an important aspect of this New Sweden experience is basically how they're surrounded by other colonies and by foreigners. There's Native Americans all around, but you have also the English down here in Maryland, and of course the Dutch up in the Hudson Valley. And both the English and the Dutch had claims to the Delaware River, and throughout their existence, the New people of New Sweden had to defend their independence and their autonomy from both the English and the Dutch. They did so successfully for a little while, but could not maintain it forever. Here is a archaeological reconstruction of what of the sort of center point of a lot of these tensions and clashes for domination of the Delaware River Valley. This is the fort that the Dutch built at what is now Newcastle to try and control the Delaware Valley and take it and to limit the influence of the Swedes. And in the end, it was when a Swedish, the person, as you probably know, what brought the end of New Sweden is the Swedes decide to capture the fort and take it over. And then the Dutch responded by capturing all of New Sweden, sending an army down from New Netherland and overwhelming the Swedes, who after a short fight surrendered. And after that surrender, New Sweden became part of the Dutch colony of New Netherland. It's another place whose history I'm very interested in. The core of New Netherland, as you know, is in the Hudson Valley. The capital was New Amsterdam, which is on Manhattan Island. The Dutch did claim land as far east as the Connecticut River and all the way west to the Delaware River, but they did not have very much control over either of those territories. Even after they captured New Sweden, the Dutch presence was pretty thin on the ground. There are just a few soldiers and officers who were in charge. The majority of the European colonists in the Delaware into the 1660s were still the Swedes and Finns. And that is a really important aspect of this history to understand. So the Dutch are in charge after the conquest, but they're a tiny minority governing over a majority of Swedes and Finns. And so they had to make a few concessions, one of which was probably the most important, was religious toleration. They allowed one of the several Swedish ministers who were in New Sweden to stay on after the conquest. This was Lars Locke, a pretty colorful character who maybe some of you have heard about before. He was one of the ministers who was in New Sweden, and he agreed to stay on after the conquest to continue ministering to the people of who stayed behind, while the other ministers had to go back. The Dutch were willing to grant a toleration, but it was a limited toleration. And I think the Dutch hoped that after, Lars Locke was not going to live forever, and then maybe after he died, they would not have to tolerate Lutheranism. But in the immediate aftermath of the conquest, they had to tolerate this. They had to keep the Swedes and Finns happy in order to govern them effectively. They also guaranteed their land rights And for that, that's part of the reason why Armagot Prince, the daughter of the governor of the colony, stayed behind to keep an eye on the family property on what's now Tinicum Island. She inherited that, and she sort of took over responsibility for the buildings and the church that had been at the center of the New Sweden colony. But she's really the only elite member of the New Sweden colony that stayed on. Pretty much all of the rest of the leaders, the military officers, the other ministers, the governor, and so forth, they all went back to Sweden. And that's really important because pretty much everybody who was left behind was just regular farmers, regular commoners and colonists. The Dutch called them the Swedish and Finnish nation because some of them were Swedes, but many of them, and probably a majority of them, were actually of Finnish ethnicity. And we don't know exactly how many there were, but there was altogether at least about 300 men, women, and children, and probably a bit more in the 16 at the time of the conquest in 1655. And that's very important because they had families, and those families continued to grow, and the growth of that community is one of the big stories here, that they were able to persist and expand around the Delaware River. Now, another thing to understand about the Swedish and Finnish nation in this period is all of the leaders had left. So there was no single person in charge. The people were basically left to govern themselves. And what was the most important way of organizing themselves were their families. Different groups of families would work together based on ties of friendship and kinship and neighborliness. They did have their minister, Lars Locke, and Armagot Prince was there, but they did not, neither the minister nor Armagot Prince had the power to command the Swedish and Finnish nation or to tell them what to do. They were authority figures, but basically the regular Swedes and Finns, they did what they wanted to. So they took control over their own lives. And that became very important because they were the ones who created a new community in America based on ideas about power and authority that came from within their own community. Now, just a reminder, most of them at the time of the conquest are living in what's now southeastern Pennsylvania. So Delaware was sort of the frontier. That's where the conflict with the Dutch had happened. And then to the east in New Jersey, to the south, further in Delaware, to the west into Pennsylvania, and also to the north, it's almost completely uninhabited by Europeans and is still dominated by Native Americans. And that's very important because the Swedes, some of the Swedish colonists had developed skills and knowledge for how to deal with Native Americans, especially learning their language and learning something about their culture, because the Swedes had depended on the fur trade for years in New Sweden. And so some of the colonists who stayed behind were experts in Native American relations. And they retained that role after the Dutch took over. In fact, the Dutch generally relied on these Swedish individuals as intermediaries in their relations with the Native Americans in the Delaware Valley after they took over. And that small group of men becomes very important because that's the beginning of a new American elite among the Swedes and Finns. It's these guys who had experience and connections to the fur trade with Native Americans that set them apart from the majority of the colonists who were just farmers. Now I come back to this picture of how you can see that New Sweden is surrounded, because now that New Sweden is part of the Dutch colony, but now the Swedes play a different role in the calculus of colonization here, because they had this comparatively large population of European colonists. And all of the neighbor colonies, Maryland and New Netherland, were pretty severely underpopulated. And so now that the Dutch had claimed the territory of New Sweden, the people of New Sweden who stayed behind become the most valuable asset. And a lot of this history of this period is about all of the different neighbors of New Sweden negotiating or trying to claim, trying to get access to Swedes and Finns to come live in their colony and work for them. Because all of these colonies had trouble attracting immigrants. And there were not many people moving to America at this period in time. So the people who were already there, the Swedish and Finnish colonists, became a very valuable resource. And this explains a lot about how the history of the Swedes on the Delaware River is very different from those on the Hudson River, where you also had some Scandinavians, Danes, Norwegians, and others who were Lutherans. But on the Hudson River, they were suffering a lot of religious persecution from Peter Stuyvesant and the Dutch church and Dutch authorities, whereas on the Delaware River, they enjoyed some religious toleration. And that is one of the main reasons, I think, that explains why the Swedes and Finns stayed on the Delaware River, even though the Dutch tried to get them to move up to the Hudson River. There was a couple of efforts and plans to persuade the Swedes or to get the Swedes and Finns to leave the Delaware River and fill in some of the gaps in the Dutch colony on New Netherland. But the Swedes and Finns said no, and they stayed on the Delaware River, and nobody could force them to move. They had the power to stay where they were, and the Dutch did not have the power or ability to force them to move somewhere else, even though they would have preferred to have them up on the Hudson River where they could control them better and where they needed more people to help protect the Hudson River from the threat of the English in New England. So they managed to persist and survive in their own territory. And that alone is something of an accomplishment, I think, that needs to be emphasized. On the other hand, over in Maryland, the English offered the Swedes all sorts of opportunities if they would move to Maryland. They sent out a proclamation promising to protect Swedish lives, liberties, and estates if they would cross the border and come over into the Chesapeake. And indeed, there's a number of Swedish and Finnish colonists moved over into Maryland, just on the other side of what's now the state border of Delaware. Some of them were runaway servants. Some of them were people who had gotten in trouble under the Swedish rule of New Sweden. But even after the Dutch took over, there was a few who were looking for opportunity. They're looking for cheap lands, or they're looking to get involved in the economy of Maryland, which was more prosperous and active than the economy on the Delaware River. And so there was always a bit of a drain of Swedish and Finnish colonists over to Maryland. And that's also another reason why the Dutch could not bully the Swedish and Finnish colonists on the Delaware River, because they could always leave. They could always escape and go over to Maryland. They had alternatives. And those alternatives increased shortly after the conquest of New Sweden, because the conquest was a very expensive thing, and the Dutch West India Company didn't have enough money to pay for all those soldiers itself. So it borrowed a bunch of money from the city of Amsterdam. And when the West India Company couldn't pay that money back, they gave half of the land of the Delaware Valley, the lower half, basically what's now Delaware and uh, southern New Jersey, to the city of Amsterdam in exchange. And the city of Amsterdam started a new colony called New Amstel on that southern half of the Delaware River Valley. And it was a small colony. They sent over about 150, 170 colonists initially. And soon after they arrived, many of them got sick and they died. So New Amstel also was another colony, along with Maryland and New Netherland, that needed colonists and it needed people. And so it tried to recruit some of the Swedish and Finnish colonists in the Delaware down to its part of the territory. Although at first the Dutch in New Amstel were not willing to be as tolerant as the New Netherland colony had been to the Dutch. It wanted the Swedish and Finns, but it did not want Lutherans in the colony. So a big part of the story here is how the Swedes and Finns managed to persuade the New Amstel colony to grant them religious toleration. And they become a big, important part of that story of the emergence of religious freedom in the Delaware River Valley in these years, precisely because of this dynamic that they're the majority of the population and everybody needs them to work for them. But there's lots of different offers coming from the Dutch in New Netherland, this English in Maryland, and now also the Dutch in New Amstel. Another interesting part of this aspect of this period of history is that in terms of Christianity, Lars Koch, the Dutch-Swedish minister, he was the main representative, the main religious authority, you could say, on the Delaware River throughout all of these years, because the Dutch, they sent over a couple of ministers for the Dutch Reformed Church, but both of them died soon after arriving. And so the Dutch tried to set up a Dutch Reformed Church, but they couldn't really get it off the ground. And so in terms of the Christian history of this region, the dominant church and the dominant religion remained Swedish Lutheranism. And that's another important bit of leverage that the Swedes and Finns had in this region. Now, Lars Koch was an important religious leader, but he was also a bit of he was an interesting character, let's say. We don't know a whole lot about him, but some of the stuff that we do know about him is not so much about his religious piety, so much as some of the other trouble that he got into, including romantic trouble. I think the thing that the people in New Sweden, the former Swedish and Dutch colonists, what they probably talked about the most, the biggest topic of gossip in these years was the minister's private life, his domestic life, because in 1661, you had this big scandal where his wife ran away with a Dutch fur trader in the month of September. They fled upriver in a canoe, probably towards the Hudson River Valley. And as far as I know, they probably settled up somewhere there. I haven't been able to trace exactly what happened with them, but they disappeared from the scene in the Delaware River Valley, and the Swedish minister Locke lost his wife. And then, interestingly enough, within about a month, he comes to the Dutch and says he wants to remarry. He wants to remarry this young girl, 17 or 18-year-old, who had probably been born in the colony. And I forget, I'm not sure exactly how old he was, but he was at least twice her age. And so the Dutch authorities were a little put off by this, both that he wanted to remarry so quickly and that the person he wanted to remarry was so young. At the same time, there were not many options for him to remarry. And what you see here is that the in terms, if you wanted to have a family, there's not going to be people coming over from Europe. You're not going to get older, more mature people. It's the young girls who are growing up in the colony who are the only people available for the men to start a family with. And, to give him the benefit of a doubt, you know, that's probably partly why he chose this particular girl who was old enough to get married, but still it seemed a little bit too much. And so the Dutch tried to put it off, tried to prevent him from getting married, but he was very, very insistent and eventually was able to marry her and start a new family. So in this atmosphere of competition, the Swedes and Finns were able to get their way in a lot of ways. They're not in power, they're not in control. But what's really interesting about this period from the perspective of the common colonists is that they're able to get a lot more rights and liberties than they had been in before, even under the Swedish period. And that culminates in 1662 when the second leader of the New Amstel colony, a man by the name of Alexander de Hinojosa, bargains hard with a bunch of mostly Finnish colonists to lure them down into New Sweden. He needs colonists. And so he gave them a really good deal, which included not just religious toleration, but also tax exemption for the next 18 years. And about 17 families of mostly Finns, as the sources say, decided to take him up on this offer, and they moved south into what's now the state of Delaware. And they established their own community. And here you can get another sense of how this community is starting to grow and develop some strength when a young Lutheran student by the name of Abelius Zetzkorn shows up in 1663. He was in training to become a minister, but he had not been fully ordained yet. But still, he had many of the qualifications, certainly enough to be able to preach. And so when this guy shows up, he becomes a bit of a rival and a threat to Minister Locke, who tried to prevent him from preaching, but the colonists wanted a preacher of their own. And in the end, they threatened Locke to basically boycott him if he would not let Zetzkorn preach to them. And so Zetzkorn did preach in the Delaware Valley for about a year or so, even though the Swedish minister Locke was not very happy with it. But the Swedish colonists were very happy with it. And this is interesting because they're getting their own way and they're starting to exercise more control over their religious life than they had ever been able to do so before. In the end, Zetzkorn never gets ordained and he doesn't set up a separate congregation. He opts to become a school teacher, and that's about the last we hear of him. So Lars Locke remains the main religious authority on the Delaware River for the next decade or so. Now, the story of New Amstel and that grant of religious liberty is really important because in 1663, New Netherland basically sells or gives the whole Delaware River Valley to the New Amstel colony. So now it's only under the authority of the government of Amsterdam. And building on the precedent of offering religious toleration to the Swedes and Finns, New Amstel actually becomes the colony with the most religious freedom and the most religious liberty in all of colonial America in 1663. And it starts attracting Mennonites and even Roman Catholics, and offering all of them religious toleration in the colony of New Amstel. Not a whole lot of people come. There's some families come, but the Swedes and Finns still remain the largest single group of Europeans on the Delaware River. But in theory, the amount of religious liberty available in New Amstel is bigger than anywhere you're going to get, even in Maryland or New England. And the Swedes and Finns were the first people to really enjoy and benefit from that. And I think that's another important point to take away from this is that the Swede Finns played a big role in the history of religious toleration in the Delaware River Valley, not because they tolerated other people so much as they were the first group to earn and receive religious liberty and to benefit from that and to really make the most of it, as you can see from these little bits of information about Zetzkorn and so forth. And this is a real contrast with the situation of Lutherans on the Hudson River, where they're under more and more persecution in the final years of New Netherland, to the point where the Lutheran community had been almost completely suppressed. So by the end of the Dutch period, you're starting to see a shift in the community of Swedes and Finns on the Delaware River. This is a map that I had put together for an article I did on the Swedes and Finns a little bit later under the English rule. But you can see here Tinicum and Upland. This is where the traditional is the heartland of New Sweden. This is where most of the original colonists had been. And up in this area is also where the men who were familiar with the fur trade and dealing with Native American diplomacy lived. But increasingly, Swedes and Finns are moving south into Delaware, which had been the New Amstel colony before it got all of the Delaware River, and Crane Hook was the main new community. That's right about where the uh, Delaware River Bridge comes over. So that whole area is the important mostly Finnish community. Some of them are moving over into Maryland. But basically, the community is sort of expanding and spreading mostly south, west, and west in this period. And you're seeing an emerging split because the people who are moving further away from the heartland of New Sweden tend to be the poorer colonists, who are mostly the Finnish colonists, and not the better off or the more influential Swedish colonists who were still living in the traditional heartland. And that is a small split that is emerging in the Swedish and Finnish community that becomes significant later on. But under the Dutch period, that's only something that's beginning. It doesn't become a real issue yet. Another important aspect of this society, this community, this period is that they're not living in villages. They're not living as a group. They're spread out in lots of individual family farms. They're the governors, the Dutch colony and some of the Swedish elites worry because everybody's living spread out up and down the river in separate farms, that they're not able to defend themselves very easily if they get attacked. So they worry, they remain very vulnerable to the Native Americans, which again is why they have to keep on maintaining good relations with the Native Americans, and they generally do. The Swedish and Finns maintain good relations. Some of the Dutch get in trouble with Native Americans, but the Swedes and Finns end up being the people who smooth out some of those conflicts. There are some efforts and some discussion to get the Swedes and Finns to live together in villages and in more dense communities, but the colonists themselves don't want to do that. They refuse, and they prefer to live spread out on their own individual farms with a larger access to all the resources of the forest and their own fields and their own family independence. And that, I think, is also very important for the health and growth of this community, because one of the things that happens in the Dutch colony of New Amstel is that disease keeps on hitting the Dutch colonists there. And the reason why the Swedish and Finns remain the major part of the population into the 1660s is that many of the Dutch colonists who came over ended up dying from disease that were brought over from Europe. And that's because they were all living close together near the main town in more denser settlements. So the Swedish and Finnish strategy of living spread out and dispersed, it left them vulnerable militarily, but in terms of their own independence and their own health, it was a very successful strategy. And it was a real key to the strength and the persistence of this community. And that, I think, is also helped them to retain and maintain their own independent identity as Swedes and Finns. And that's another important point to emphasize, because the Dutch did not want them to remain separate or independent from the Dutch. They wanted to incorporate them into Dutch society. They wanted to mix them up with other Dutch colonists. They wanted to dilute their ethnic and religious distinctiveness. They wanted to hopefully eventually get rid of the Lutheran Church. And again, if you compare the situation of the Swedes and Finns on the Delaware River Valley with those of the Scandinavian Lutherans in the Hudson River Valley, you really do see the difference, because on the Hudson River, a lot of the Lutherans eventually assimilated with the Dutch, and a number of them became Dutch Reformed. They intermarried with families, and a lot of what we think of are the typical Dutch of New York are people who are descended not from Dutch families, but from German or Scandinavian families that had been living in New Netherlands and been assimilated into Dutch society. So that was a real possibility. That was a real option. And that was the ideal goal for the Dutch on the Delaware River Valley, but they were never able to do that to the Swedes and Finns on the Delaware River Valley. So New Sweden, that they're able to persist because of these peculiar circumstances that I've been talking about here on the Delaware River Valley, and they maintain their community and they maintain their distinctive identity and they maintain their different religion in the Dutch period. And that becomes really crucial, because when the English arrived to conquer the Dutch colony in 1664, the Swedes and Finns are remain an important, distinct unit of people that they have to negotiate with. And in fact, they negotiate with the Swedes and Finns before they conquer the Dutch fort of New Amstel, and they offer them the same benefits, saying they'll give them religious toleration, they'll respect their legal and property rights if if they don't support the Dutch. And all they wanted, the English just asked the Swedes and Finns to remain neutral. They didn't ask them to help them conquer the Dutch. They just said, stay back out of the fight. And the Swedes and Finns do. They stay home. They don't support the Dutch. And so the English are able to conquer New Amstel and turn the Delaware Valley into an English colony. The English think that they're making the Swedes happy because they're bringing them back under a monarchical government. The Dutch, of course, were a republic. They didn't have a king. Swedes back in England, back in Europe, they came from a monarchical society, and so now the English tried to sell their new existence under English rule as a return to the benefits of living under a monarchical society. But they also had all these independent rights that they had earned under the Dutch, and they managed to maintain them and expand them under the English. And it's under the English, after the English colonists, that the Swedes and Finns start spreading out into a lot of the places where they're famous for now, further west into Pennsylvania, and then east into New Jersey. But the other thing that happens under the English period that had not happened under the Dutch period is that the Swedes and Finns you start to see the social divisions emerging within the community. And you see this in an incident known as the Revolt of the Longweed. I've researched and written about this before. I don't have time to go into detail here now, but basically a Swedish guy shows up and says that he's come from Sweden and with a promise to restore the Delaware River to Swedish rule, to restore New Sweden. And a lot of the colonists, especially the poorer ones, the Finns, support him. and they get very excited at this possibility of getting rid of the English and getting rid of the Dutch and returning to Swedish rule. But in the end, nothing happens because the Swedish elites, those guys who were specialists with the fur trade and in Native American diplomacy, and who were the key mediators, the people who were negotiating first with the Dutch authorities and then with the English authorities on behalf of the larger Swedish and Finnish community, they betray this guy and turn him over to the English authorities before anything is able to come of it. And so you see this split that had been emerging within the Swedish and Finnish community under the Dutch rule comes to fruition under English rule. So the community exists and it persists and it's strong, but it's no longer united. Nevertheless, the Swedes and Finns remained on the land, and they remained an important part of the European population in the Delaware River until the end of the 17th century. And when William Penn comes in and takes over to start his colony of Pennsylvania, he also has to negotiate with the Swedes and Finns, and he also relies on some of those Swedish and Finnish colonists to help him negotiate with Native Americans and to build up the strength of his colony. So everything that happens in the Delaware Valley, both the Dutch colonies and the English colonies, including Pennsylvania, all of them are building on the foundation laid by New Sweden and sustained by the Swedish and Finnish colonists who remained after the colony, whose story I've been telling you here today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Evan. That was absolutely fascinating. We have time to answer a couple of questions. If anybody has a question, please submit it in the chat. Otherwise, if you'd like to raise your hand using the raise hand function, I'd be happy to get to you. We did have one question in the chat. So Evan, you had mentioned Lars Locke and Lars Koch. They're different people, but
Yes.
you were referencing Lars Locke for the most part.
Yes, I was. Sorry, that was a typo. Koch is the name of the guy who's one of the main Native American negotiators, and he's becomes the important secular leader of the community.
Very good. Very good. All right. Let me see. We have one question from, I apologize, I don't know his name. It's GAMB 303700294. What is your question?
Oh, about Finnish
Yeah,
religion?
my concern was I'm George Ambrose from the Friends of the Swedish Cabin, and I've been involved with that, and I've done a book on the log cabins of New Sweden. And one of the things that I think you underestimate in your presentation is the fact that the Finns and the Swedes were pretty separate groups almost from the beginning. They weren't hostile to one another, but the Finns certainly chose to live separately. They were the ones that built remote farmsteads away from settlements. The few Swedes that were there clustered together around the forts and the headquarters, and the Finns were the ones that had a sympathetic lifestyle, and that's who established the good relationships with the native people because of that sympathical lifestyle. I could list you about 10 or 12 things that they shared in common. But I think that the split, you're talking about the split between those two groups coming later, like 1669 when the English had arrived, was something that existed almost from the beginning. The Finns were brought over because they could not attract Swedes to leave the good life in Sweden. They had a mercantile colony for the first few vessels who were protected by a handful of soldiers and accompanied by Dutch sailors who then returned. And the only people that stayed were the people that had to, and to get settlers, the outlawing of slash and burn agriculture at the clearing of the forest outside of Stockholm made this Finns outlaws, and they were given a choice between choosing prison in Sweden or exile in America. And when they got over here, they found vast American forests, which were like the homeland, and wrote to their friends and relatives and said, "Get over here as fast as you can. There are so few Swedes. No one's keeping an eye on us, and we can live as we want." And our cabin, I know in particular, was built by settlers from Varmland province who were Finns.
Very interesting.
Yes, no, you're absolutely right. And I think um, it's hard on available documents to see exactly everything that's going on. There is definitely that difference was there from the beginning. The revolt of the Long Swede is the first time that becomes sort of a public issue or a public order issue. And I refer to it as the revolt of the Long Swede mostly when talking to outsiders,
Well,
because people have heard about New Sweden, and believe that the connection is to Sweden, but often referred to as the Long Finn as well. So it's possible that he was Finnish, or they called him the Long Finn, meaning tall Finn, um, because most of the people who supported him were Finnish rather than Swedish. It's a little ambiguous sometimes with some of these issues of ethnicity, but you're right. It is Finns who are mostly moving away from the core and setting up these more isolated farmsteads, and that sort of farming lifestyle, the slash and burn, more subsistence life, farming style, is very much is very Finnish.
Fascinating. If there is any more questions, I know Anne Charlotte uh, mentioned that she knows quite a bit about the Swedes and the Finns, but not the Dutch. So she thanks you much. Um, and there is an individual, Donald Cox, who is a descendant of Peter Larson Cock, which is fascinating. So,
Yes.
so it is around 8 o'clock. If there are no more questions, what I'd love to do is give a plug for our next, or rather our final lecture of 2025. It will feature Paul Finkelman, and it will feature Peter Stuyvesant's War on Swedes and Other Lutherans. Evan, I do believe that you referenced Peter Stuyvesant at one point in your presentation as well, which is a really interesting connection. Now, the event will take place at the American Swedish Historical Museum, so it will not be on Zoom. It'll take place from 9 to 12. It'll feature an in-person, well, rather a lecture on Zoom, and an in-person brunch. Two of our other lecturers will be there as well, Paul Cahan and Jay Smith, to answer any questions you might have had on John Morton. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming. Before I go, Sandy recommends the New Amsterdam History Center for the Dutch as something to visit. Evan, thank you so much. It was absolutely fascinating. And hopefully you have a good rest of your day in Japan. I know your day is just starting while ours here are more or less ending.
Thank you very much, and thank you for this wonderful opportunity to revisit this history and to connect with people who really know and care about it. I really appreciate this possibility, and I'll look forward to working more on this and to hopefully seeing you in time soon. Best of
Very
rest of
good. Very good. Thank you. And I'd love to also thank the rest of the New Sweden Legacy Lecture Series committee. Thank you, everybody, for your hard work in helping to get these wonderful lectures to talk about such a fascinating and important topic that, you know, fascinatingly enough, despite the fact that it was a little less than 20 years, has such long roots and such long branches that connect to a variety of different topics. So, Evan, thank you so much again. Everybody, thank you so much for hanging out with us tonight, and we will see you hopefully at our next lecture as well. Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.